This podcast of This American Life is supported by Audible.com, with over 150,000 audiobooks, including titles by David Sedaris and many other contributors to This American Life. For a free audiobook of your choice, go to audible.com/American.
Okay, America, prepare to have your life change for the better. There is a situation that you find yourself in all the time, and it has been unclear what to say or do in that situation. Until now.
Well, I mean, we heard about it, and it was like Post-its. It was just all of a sudden something that you needed to use all the time. It just explained so much.
It's Nancy Updike, one of the regular contributors to our radio show, and she tells the story this way. A couple of years ago, friends of hers were traveling in Europe, and they're walking through these old buildings, and these people do not know anything special about architecture. But you know how it is when you're a tourist. They're walking through these buildings, and they're looking at the doorways and the tiles, and they decide that they think that this one building has a very Moorish influence. And they're pointing out details and saying the Moor is this and the Moor is that. And finally, one of them turns to the other and says, you know what, we sound like we're in a magazine called Modern Jackass. Modern Jackass. Of course, there is no Modern Jackass. But ever since I heard that story, I find myself referring to Modern Jackass all the time. It's incredibly useful. And it can be useful to you, to back out of all kinds of awkward conversational situations.
The thing about Modern Jackass is it's usually not something about which you know nothing. It's something about which you know a little bit, enough to sort of get yourself into trouble.
Like you read an article.
Exactly. Or something on the web.
Just last weekend, I was out for breakfast with some friends. And we got into this conversation about these people who do caloric restriction. Have you heard about this? Apparently, there's these people who believe that if you eat a lot less, it can make you live longer. And so we're talking about this, and somebody's explaining, you know, the cells of your body go through all this wear and tear when you actually digest food. And before you know it, one of my friends, somebody who knows nothing about biology actually, starts talking about mitochondria. Mitochondria. And maybe he had a little bit of knowledge about this, but it was totally Modern Jackass. Modern Jackass, the medical edition. Which Nancy says, actually, she finds herself in quite a bit.
You know, my mother sends me information about partially hydrogenated oils. And then when somebody says, wait, why is partially hydrogenated oil bad again? And I say, well, it's an unstable compound, which it is. It's oil to which hydrogen has been added in order to make it solid at room temperature. That I know. That's a fact.
And why would that be bad, Nancy?
Well, that's where we get into Modern Jackass territory. It's unstable in your body. There's an extra hydrogen atom that can interact with things.
Oxygen and form water.
Exactly.
Having no information, that's one thing. That's pure. The trouble is when you have a little bit of information about the problems with electronic voting machines, what it really means, the battle between carbs and protein. It's hard for some people not to take the tiny pigment contained in that tiny bit of information and paint a vast canvas of the entire world. It's exactly the problem that people encounter in every story in our program today. It's This American Life from WBEZ Chicago. Today we bring you 4 stories of people taking a tiny smidgen of understanding and stretching it far past the breaking point. Because as everybody knows, all over the world, a little bit of knowledge can be a very entertaining thing. We have Dan Savage matching wits with a 6-year-old boy. Stay with us. Act 1, when small thoughts meet big brains. We have this story about people functioning with a tiny little bit of knowledge, long past the point that you think they would, from Alex Blumberg.
I can reconstruct the events that led me to one of the most embarrassing conversations of my adult life. The chain starts back when I was 11 or 12, and I first heard the term Nielsen family. I was probably listening to some adults talk, and from their conversation I gathered that networks consulted Nielsen families to find out how popular a television show was. But that didn't make sense. Why would they only ask people named Nielsen which shows they liked? I started thinking. I knew that when they figured things like this out, they didn't ask everybody, they just asked a small percentage of people and then extrapolated. I think I figured they'd done some research and found that the name Nielsen, because it was a common name maybe, and it seemed to cut across class and economic lines, actually came pretty close to a representative sample. I knew this wasn't the way they measured public opinion now, but it seemed like the Nielsen surveys had been around for a while, and I figured they were just a holdover from a more primitive, less statistically rigorous time. After that, I really didn't think about it again. Or if I did, it was only with a mild curiosity. I wonder why TV still does it that way. Fast forward 20 years. I was talking with a friend of mine who was telling me about her friend who'd been selected to be a Nielsen family. And I said to her, "Isn't it weird that they're all named Nielsen?" My friend looked at me for what seemed like a long time. Somewhere during her very long pause, because of the very long pause, in fact, I realized, of course they're not all named Nielsen. That makes no sense at all. At the time of this conversation, I was 34 years old, and I couldn't believe I'd gotten this far without ever stopping to think it through. It made me wonder what else I'd missed, and if this has ever happened to anyone besides me.
When I was a kid, and I would see the school crossing signs, and there's a picture of the little kids walking, and then it would say, "School X-ing." Mm-hmm. And I thought that the X-ing was a word, and I pronounced it zing.
Turns out, I'm not alone. I've been talking to people about this for weeks, and there's a lot of us out there, like me and this woman, Jody Mace, carting around our childhood beliefs well into adulthood. Jody thought there were lots of zings, deer zings, railroad zings. It makes sense.
Well, I was in my 20s, and I was walking into work, and about 10 geese walked in front of me on the sidewalk. And so I just turned to my coworker and casually said, "It looks like they should have a zing sign there for the geese." There was sort of a long, awkward silence. And I thought that he was thinking, that really is a good idea. But instead he finally said, zing isn't a word.
In talking to people, I found out that a lot of these lingering misconceptions involve mispronunciation. And often, the mispronunciation survives into adulthood because the mistake just sounds better, or makes more sense.
It should be a word, and it should be zing. You don't want a kid to walk slowly across the crossing. If he's smart, he's going to zing.
Consider the word misled. I talked to 3 people, including my own father, who used to pronounce it misled. All 3 believed it was the past tense of a non-existent verb, misel, which means to deceive or to mislead. There's another guy I spoke to who thought well into his early 20s that the word quesadilla was Spanish for what's the deal. Most of the common childhood myths, like that babies come from storks, get corrected sooner or later. They're not obscure enough to sneak into adulthood unscrutinized. But occasionally, even a very popular childhood myth can make it through. Like unicorns.
In my head, a unicorn wasn't really any different than a zebra.
This is Christy Kruger.
In terms of believability, I think the unicorn's really ahead of the dinosaur.
What do you mean?
Well, when you think about a dinosaur, it's like from a kid's perspective, a dinosaur is like these really large, monstrous animals roaming the earth. And then you have a unicorn, which is basically just a horse with a horn.
As Christy Kruger grew up, she says that if she ever thought about unicorns, they were on a grassy plain somewhere in Africa, drinking from a watering hole with the wildebeest and the impala. And then one night, she found herself in a conversation at a party.
It was about a group of 5 to 7 people kind of standing around the keg, just talking. And somehow